Bonjour tout le monde. Donc, je me présente, Benoît Desty, directeur académique du CIQSS et professeur d'économie à HEC Montréal. Bienvenue à cet atelier sur le fichier de microdonnées de recherche sur les entreprises, tenu dans le cadre de l'école d'été du CIQSS. Donc, allez voir notre site web si vous cherchez d'autres activités pour votre été. Donc, on est très heureux d'accueillir aujourd'hui 3 personnes de Statistique Canada, de la division d'analyse économique, qui vont nous parler de ce nouvel ensemble de données qui est disponible présentement au CIQSS. Ça fait quand même quelques mois que les données entreprises ont fait leur apparition au CIQSS de façon plus formelle. Donc, vous avez peut-être entendu parler de l'enquête sur le financement des petites et moyennes entreprises ou le programme d'analyse longitudinale de l'emploi. Mais là, on atteint un peu le Saint Graal des données d'entreprise avec ce fichier-là. On va commencer par une présentation d'Amélie Lafrance, qui est chef à la division d'analyse économique de Statistique Canada, qui va nous faire une présentation plus générale de ce fichier de données-là. Et ensuite, on va voir deux applications, deux exemples d'applications qui ont utilisé ces données-là pour qu'on voit un peu leur potentiel analytique. Les applications vont être en anglais. La première sur l'investissement par Wulong Gu, conseiller principal à la division d'analyse économique à Statistique Canada, et une présentation sur le patenting, j'oublie, les brevets et la croissance des entreprises par Danny Leung, directeur à la division d'analyse économique de Statistique Canada. Tout au long de la présentation, je vous incite à utiliser le chat pour vos questions. Et je me donnerai la permission d'interrompre la présentation pour des questions de clarification tout au long des prochaines heures. À la fin, on espère qu'il va rester un peu du temps pour des questions formelles, auquel cas, je prendrai les questions. Il faudra utiliser la fonction « lever la main » en Zoom pour qu'on vous donne la parole pour poser votre question. Et ça, c'est peut-être pour terminer, c'est microdonnées de recherche pour entreprises. C'est un peu un premier pas. Il y a un autre fichier qui est supposé s'en venir dans les prochains mois, qui serait un appariement entre données d'entreprise et données employées. Je ne sais pas si Amélie va en parler dans sa présentation, mais en tout cas, moi, ça m'intéresse beaucoup. Donc, je laisse la parole en premier à Amélie Lafrance, comme je disais, chef à la division d'analyse économique de Statistique Canada, qui va nous présenter les données. Amélie, c'est à toi.
Merci. Je vais juste partager mon écran. Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran, vous m'entendez?
Oui, peut-être. Oui,
okay.
Parfait.
Super. Et donc, merci pour l'invitation et l'opportunité de présenter cette base de données aujourd'hui. Donc, c'est ça, Benoît, il a déjà mentionné qu'il y a eu beaucoup de progrès en termes de l'accès aux microdonnées de recherche sur les entreprises ou les microdonnées sur les entreprises en général dans les dernières années. Et c'est quelque chose qu'on continue d'améliorer. J'ai une collègue, Beryl Lee, qui va également faire une présentation plus tard cette semaine au Canadian Economic Association, donc à la conférence, qui va parler aussi des autres développements qui se passent du côté de l'accès et de microdonnées sur les entreprises. Donc, moi, je vais principalement discuter d'une base de données qui a été qui est maintenant disponible dans les centres de données de recherche depuis le mois de mars. Donc, je vais parler en général, premièrement, sur les microdonnées d'entreprise pour donner un petit peu de contexte. Je vais parler de la base de données, les MRE qu'on appelle les microdonnées de recherche sur les entreprises. Et finalement, je vais parler un peu des logistiques en termes d'accès aux microdonnées. Donc, les microdonnées d'entreprise, il y a beaucoup d'opportunités en termes d'analyse sur les entreprises, mais elles ont aussi des défis qui sont uniques à ce type de données. Donc, l'identité des unités doit être protégée. Donc, aucune personne ou entreprise ne peut être identifiée directement ou indirectement à partir de ces données. Et contrairement aux unités dans les microdonnées sociales, celles dans les microdonnées d'entreprise peuvent être facilement identifiées même sans identificateur direct. Donc, la répartition des données d'entreprise est souvent asymétrique, de sorte qu'il il peut être difficile de protéger l'identité des grandes entreprises. Donc, on sait qu'il y a beaucoup plus de petites entreprises que de très grandes entreprises. Donc, de ce côté-là, déjà, si on commence à regarder une certaine variable comme les ventes ou l'emploi, ça peut devenir assez facile d'identifier une entreprise. Et les données pour certaines dimensions sont peu nombreuses. Donc, par exemple, si on croise une industrie détaillée avec une région géographique détaillée, il peut encore être facile d'identifier une entreprise. Donc, c'est tous des choses qu'on doit considérer lorsqu'on donne l'accès aux microdonnées d'entreprise. Et finalement, il existe aussi de plus grands incitatifs financiers à identifier les renseignements détaillés de certaines entreprises et de leurs concurrents. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose que Benoît a déjà mentionné. On a déjà eu 2 projets pilotes qui ont été élaborés et disponibles dans les centres de données de recherche. Donc, en 2018, on a eu le programme d'analyse longitudinale de l'emploi lié aux données du T2, donc le PAL T2. Donc, celui-là a été introduit en avril 2018. Et également l'enquête sur le financement et la croissance des petites et moyennes entreprises de 2014, couplée à des données administratives en 2018. Donc, les projets pilotes, il y avait eu certaines élaborations qui ont eu lieu. Donc, il y a eu une demande de proposition, on a produit des webinaires un peu comme celui-ci pour introduire les bases de données. Et il y a eu des projets de recherche approuvés qui sont axés sur l'analyse multivariée qui ont été menés dans les CDR en 2018 et 2020. Les chercheurs ont élaboré leur modèle au moyen de données synthétiques dans les CDR. Donc, il y a vraiment accès c'était vraiment des données synthétiques et non réelles. Et ensuite, les programmes étaient envoyés au CDR par les analyses des centres de données de recherche en vue de l'exécution de ces programmes avec les données réelles. Et les résultats finaux, ils étaient sortis du CDRE par courriel. Donc, c'est un peu semblable à comment c'est organisé pour les données sociales, à l'exception de comment les chercheurs pouvaient visionner les données. Et les objectifs de ces projets pilotes, c'était vraiment à partir de l'expérience acquise, de produire des ensembles de données semblables qui pourraient être, de manière continue, être implémentées dans les CDR. Donc, les microdonnées de recherche sur les entreprises ou les MRE, donc, celles-ci sont un ensemble de données administratives à l'échelle des entreprises et elles ont été ajoutées parmi les bases de données des CDR. La couverture qui est inclue en ce moment-ci, c'est de 2017 et elles comprennent toutes les entreprises constituées en société au Canada qui ont produit une déclaration T2, un feuillet T4 ou un formulaire PD7. Donc, pour les T2, c'est principalement, ce sont des entreprises incorporées. Le feuillet T4, c'est pour les entreprises qui ont des employés. Et même chose pour le formulaire PD7, c'est aussi des entreprises qui ont des employés, mais ce fichier-là ou ce formulaire-là, c'est un formulaire qui est rempli à tous les mois versus le T4 qui est rempli une fois par année. La période qui est comprise dans la base de données est de 2000 à 2017. Et en termes d'industrie, ce sont toutes les industries comprises dans les secteurs des codes 2 chiffres du CIAN, sauf celles des services d'enseignement, des soins de santé, de l'assistance sociale et les administrations publiques. Donc, on se concentre vraiment sur le secteur des entreprises ou le secteur privé, si vous voulez. Et la base de données, donc une grande base de données, et elle est composée de plusieurs fichiers. Celui principal, je dirais que c'est le fichier de microdonnées longitudinales des comptes nationaux. Donc, celui-ci, c'est un peu une extension du PAL T2 que j'ai mentionné tantôt. C'est vraiment, je dirais, l'univers des entreprises et c'est une base de données qu'on développe maintenant, ça fait quelques années. Elle contient beaucoup de variables. Puis, on a pris certaines des variables de cette base de données pour créer les MRE. Puis, je vous invite aussi, j'aurais dû mentionner avant, mais le dictionnaire des données est disponible sur le site crdcn.org. Donc, peut-être qu'on peut le mettre tantôt dans le chat. Donc, si jamais vous avez des questions, vous voulez savoir ce qui est disponible, je vous invite à le consulter. Moi, je vais juste en couvrir quelques-unes. Une autre composante, c'est la module propriétaire d'entreprise de la base de données canadienne sur la dynamique employeur-employé. Donc ici, on a vraiment pris une variable de cette module pour pouvoir mesurer les propriétaires ou les propriétaires, quel est le genre ou la majorité du genre ou le sexe des entreprises. Donc, par exemple, est-ce que c'est une entreprise qui appartient majoritairement à des femmes, majoritairement à des hommes ou à part égale, hommes et femmes. Une autre composante, c'est le commerce selon les caractéristiques des exportateurs et des importateurs. Oh oui, j'aurais dû mentionner aussi que pour le module propriétaire d'entreprise, les données sont disponibles seulement de 2005 à 2013. Pour les exportations, importations, c'est de 2010 à 2017. Donc, on n'a pas tout à fait les données jusqu'à l'année 2000. Donc, en termes d'exportateur-importateur, on peut déterminer si une entreprise est exportatrice ou si elle importe. Et il y a d'autres variables associées telles que la valeur de ces exportations et importations. Les dépenses en recherche scientifique et développement expérimental, donc celle-là, c'est l'annexe 32 qu'une entreprise peut déclarer des dépenses en recherche scientifique et développement expérimental aux fins de crédit d'impôt. Donc, c'est une mesure qui est souvent utilisée par les chercheurs pour analyser les investissements en R&D. Et finalement, le Programme canadien de productivité sur le travail, sur le capital, le travail, l'énergie, les matières et les services, qu'on appelle en anglais le CLEMS. Donc ici, ce sont vraiment des indices qu'on peut utiliser pour déflater les variables. Donc, par exemple, il y a un indice sur le produit intérieur brut, et celles-ci sont souvent utilisées par les chercheurs lorsqu'ils examinent des variables au fil du temps. Donc, en termes de variables, on a deux types de variables dans les MRE. La première, c'est de base, donc celles-ci sont traitées à partir des fichiers T2, T4 ou PD7 et du registre des entreprises de Statistique Canada. Donc, ce sont vraiment des variables qu'on prend directement de ces fichiers et on ne fait pas de changement. Donc, par exemple, dans les fichiers T2, on a l'information sur les ventes des entreprises, le revenu, les dépenses. Donc, ce sont tous des variables qu'on ne traite pas. Et contrairement aux variables de base, on a aussi des variables analytiques. Et celles-ci sont calculées à partir des déclarations T2, du module des propriétaires, des recherches et développements, le CCE, donc les exportations, importations, et le CLEMS. Donc, tous les indices, par exemple, ce sont tous des indices qui ont été calculés. On a aussi plusieurs autres variables dans les recherches et développement qu'on a calculées nous-mêmes. Donc, par exemple, la recherche et développement qui est achetée par l'entreprise versus celle qui est produite par l'entreprise ou à l'intérieur de l'entreprise. Donc, l'idée pour les variables analytiques, c'était vraiment de rendre ça accessible aux chercheurs parce que par le passé, on a souvent eu des demandes de chercheurs nous demandant dans la division d'analyse économique, comment est-ce que vous avez produit cette variable? Est-ce que je peux la reproduire? Donc, c'était vraiment pour ajouter de la transparence aux variables, mais aussi pour faciliter le travail des chercheurs. Donc, celle-ci repose sur la théorie économique, l'usage courant et, comme j'ai dit, donc, il y a des études qui ont été publiées par la division d'analyse économique. Elles réduisent les obstacles à l'accès à l'information pour les chercheurs externes dans leur projet. Elles sont bien documentées et elles sont présentes aux fins de reproductibilité. Et au fil du temps, on va continuer d'ajouter d'autres variables pour qu'elles soient accessibles à tous les chercheurs. Donc, il y a plusieurs études ou analyses qui peuvent être élaborées à partir des microdonnées de recherche sur des entreprises. Donc, par exemple, on peut examiner la dynamique des entreprises, l'investissement, la productivité, le genre en termes des propriétaires, les entrées et sorties, les importations et exportations et les recherches et développement. Donc, il y a elle présente beaucoup d'opportunités en termes de recherche. Bon, donc en termes d'accès, donc ceci a été mentionné que cette base de données, elle a été Elle a été diffusée dans les CDR en mars 2021, donc elle est maintenant prête à être utilisée. Pour ça, on vous demande de soumettre une demande d'accès via le système d'application du portail d'accès aux microdonnées. Et ce qu'on vise, c'est vraiment d'approuver les projets de recherche qui sont axés sur l'analyse multivariée seulement. Donc ici, ce qu'on veut dire, c'est qu'on ne pourra pas donner accès à quelqu'un qui veut simplement produire des tableaux personnalisés. Donc ceux-ci, si c'est le cas, on les produirait nous-mêmes dans notre division et on les diffuserait. Mais vraiment, le but de donner l'accès à ces microdonnées, c'est pour des projets de recherche axés sur l'analyse multivariée. Et les projets approuvés seront ensuite menés dans les CDR partout au pays. Et ici, contrairement à ce qui était présenté dans les projets pilotes, c'est que vous auriez accès aux données réelles avec des identificateurs d'entreprises anonymisés. Donc, on n'utilise plus un système de données synthétiques. Et les journaux de programme, ils sont soumis à une surveillance. Ici, c'est pour s'assurer que vous n'essayez pas d'identifier une entreprise. Donc, en termes d'admissibilité, le chercheur principal est un citoyen canadien ou un résident permanent du Canada. Et pour devenir une personne réputée être employée de Statistique Canada, donc ça, c'est ce qu'on demande lorsque vous allez avoir accès aux données, tous les chercheurs doivent procéder à une enquête de sécurité, avoir une absence de conflit d'intérêt, soumettre une lettre de reconnaissance de l'employeur ou de l'établissement d'enseignement et prêter serment ou l'affirmation d'office et de discrétion en vertu du paragraphe 6.1 de la loi sur la statistique. Donc ici, c'est ce qu'on demande à tous les chercheurs pour devenir des personnes réputées être employées de Statistique Canada. Et en termes du serment, c'est quelque chose que toute personne qui est employée par Statistique Canada doit faire. Donc, ce qu'on demande à la proposition, c'est la justification de la recherche. Donc, quel est le contexte, quelle est votre question de recherche et quelle serait votre contribution de votre projet à la littérature sur le sujet. On demande aussi une bonne description du cadre analytique et de la méthodologie proposée. Donc, celle-ci sera évaluée, je vais en parler après, mais elle sera évaluée par un comité à Statistique Canada. Et une des parties importantes du cadre analytique ou de votre proposition, c'est de justifier l'utilisation des microdonnées. Donc, pourquoi est-ce que vous avez besoin d'utiliser des microdonnées versus ce qui est disponible sur le site de Statistique Canada ou sur un autre site. On vous demande aussi d'avoir un besoin détaillé en matière de données et de nous spécifier l'emplacement du CDR à partir duquel vous allez accéder aux données. Et en termes de produits attendus, donc ici, c'est aux fins de la vérification de la confidentialité de vos produits. On demande une description détaillée des résumés statistiques et des modèles de régression que vous avez produits. Donc, ça, c'est vraiment pour faciliter la vérification de vos tableaux, de vos résultats. Donc, l'évaluation des propositions, c'est réalisé par Statistique Canada, ce que j'ai mentionné avant. Donc, on examine la viabilité des données de la recherche proposée, la pertinence des méthodes à appliquer et le besoin fondé d'accéder au MRE. Et les propositions seront acceptées et évaluées en continu. Donc, on n'a pas vraiment de date limite pour accepter des propositions. La base de données est disponible maintenant pour un bon bout de temps, je dirais. Donc, en termes d'attente chronologique, ici, c'est pour comprendre que c'est plus les projets à long terme, je dirais, pour ceux qui utilisent des données, des microdonnées sur les entreprises. Donc, en termes de le processus de demande, ça peut prendre jusqu'à 3 mois. Une des raisons, c'est à cause qu'il y a un examen institutionnel des propositions de projet. Puis ça comprend les communications avec les divisions thématiques et les révisions des propositions pendant la phase d'examen. On doit également, comme j'ai mentionné avant, vous allez remplir un formulaire de conflit d'intérêt. Et s'il y a lieu, il peut y avoir d'autres retards à prévoir avant qu'une résolution ne soit trouvée. D'autres considérations aussi qui sont importantes à considérer, c'est que travailler avec les les microdonnées de recherche sur les entreprises. Pour les nouveaux utilisateurs de microdonnées d'entreprise, il y a une cour d'apprentissage de 3 mois. Où on dirait qu'il y a une bonne cour d'apprentissage. Ça peut prendre quelques mois avant de comprendre comment utiliser les données. C'est très différent des données sociales ou des individus que vous connaissez probablement. Donc, c'est à prévoir avant l'analyse des données. Et nous, on recommande que l'accès au MRE, ça ne soit pas pour ceux qui ont une période limitée pour leur recherche. Donc, par exemple, les étudiants de maîtrise. Donc, comme j'ai dit, c'est vraiment c'est plus des projets à long terme ou à plus long terme, plus que 3 mois, je dirais, ce qui est à considérer. Donc, en termes de la publication des résultats finaux, donc ici, on va faire une vérification de la confidentialité. Donc, les résultats finaux sont soumis à une vérification dans les CDR et sont également appuyés par le comité de vérification en collaboration avec les divisions thématiques de Statistique Canada. Les résultats intermédiaires ne sont pas autorisés. Donc, ici, ce qu'on veut dire, c'est qu'on cherche vraiment ou on vous demande de vraiment nous soumettre vos résultats finaux. Lorsqu'il y a des résultats intermédiaires, des fois, il peut y avoir un risque qu'on ne pourra pas vous donner d'autres résultats si vous le demandez plus tard. Donc, par exemple, si vous avez produit un tableau et vous voulez faire un changement, une certaine variable, ou vous voulez enlever certaines entreprises de votre échantillon, il peut y avoir un risque que, puisque vous avez déjà eu un tableau qui vous a été soumis, il peut y avoir un risque de confidentialité si on vous donne un autre tableau. Donc, il faut toujours qu'on évalue la confidentialité en vertu de ce qui vous a déjà été envoyé. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on demande vraiment que vous nous soumettez vos résultats finaux. Et les statistiques descriptives sont limitées à celles qui prennent en charge l'analyse multivariée. Donc, encore une fois, comme j'ai mentionné avant, on vise à qu'il n'y ait pas seulement des tableaux personnalisés, mais les tableaux sont permis s'ils sont vraiment associés à l'analyse multivariée. Et le délai d'exécution, il peut être plus long à prévoir que les normes des CDR actuelles. Donc, ça peut prendre un peu plus de temps de vérifier la confidentialité des données d'entreprise que les données sur les individus. Et finalement, les résultats validés seront diffusés par les analystes des CDR par courriel. Donc, ici aussi, c'est semblable aux microdonnées sociales ou sur les individus. Oui, donc c'est tout pour moi. Donc, je vous invite à poser vos questions.
Merci, Amélie. Moi, je passerai peut-être aux applications avant de voir des questions plus générales à tout le monde. Mais juste avant de passer aux questions, passer aux autres applications, deux choses que je voulais préciser. On a eu des questions dans le chat. Les vidéos, les transparents de la présentation vont être disponibles à tout le monde par après. Donc, si vous avez manqué quelque chose, vous pourrez réécouter à loisir. Aussi, tu as mentionné l'ajout de variables. Est-ce que les chercheurs peuvent avoir un input sur les variables qui vont être ajoutées à ce fichier-là?
Bien, présentement, la liste est pas mal finale, mais je dirais que s'il y a un intérêt ou il y a beaucoup d'intérêt pour une certaine variable qui n'est pas disponible, on pourrait le considérer.
OK. OK. Puis, concernant les différences dans les procédures d'accès entre les données sociales et les données entreprises, tu as mentionné la lettre de l'employeur, qui pour un professeur pourrait être la lettre d'un vice-recteur à la recherche. Mais est-ce qu'il y a d'autres particularités, par exemple, au niveau de la détention d'actifs pour les données entreprises? Est-ce que c'est la même chose que pour l'accès à Statistique Canada ou vu que c'est en CDR, on n'est pas obligé d'avoir un Asset Freeze Agreement, par exemple, ou des choses comme ça?
Bien, ça viendrait dans le conflit d'intérêt.
Dans le conflit d'intérêt, OK. Donc, une déclaration de conflit d'intérêt qui est à remplir. Donc, ça, c'est différent de...
Ouais.
Je vois quelqu'un dans le chat qui demande est-ce que l'innovation, les crédits d'impôt et subventions pour innovation seront disponibles dans ce fichier-là?
Ça, il faudrait que je regarde. Je sais qu'en termes de recherche et développement, oui, mais ça dépend du type de l'innovation que vous... Oui.
OK, bien, ça me fait penser... Ouais, excusez.
Ben, je veux dire, les données sont administratives. Donc, si on comprend certaines annexes, comme l'annexe 32, puis on a aussi je pense que c'est l'annexe 8. En anglais, c'est le Capital Cost Allowance. Donc, ça aussi, c'est inclus. Donc, cette partie-là, oui.
OK, merci. Ben, ça me fait penser ça, que si vous avez des questions sur les données ou sur l'accès, ben, je ne vais pas mettre Amélie sur la sellette, peut-être passer par nous. Je veux dire moi ou Carole Vincent, qui est directrice générale du CIQSS. Donc, vous trouvez nos coordonnées sur le site du CIQSS pour vos questions, puis on pourra relayer vos questions aux personnes les plus à propos pour y répondre. Je vois une autre question dans le chat. Est-ce qu'il y a une variable sur l'investissement en technologie verte dans les MRE pour les entreprises industrielles?
Non.
Non, il n'y a pas de... OK, je ne vois rien d'autre dans le chat. On pourra revenir plus tard. Donc, je passerai aux applications. Merci encore beaucoup, Amélie, pour la présentation. Les applications sont en anglais. La première, the first application by Wulong Gu of Statistique Canada, the drivers of business investments in Canada. So, Wulong, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks
yes.
thanks for coming virtually to Montreal to present us this market.
Yeah, thank you, Benoit. It's good to see you. And check if it's working. Just a minute. All right. Right. Can you see this?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hi, good morning. Hopefully see you soon in person, but still it's great to talk to you. So this is, as Benoit said, this is the first application of the how we use the microdata to examine economic questions. So my title is The Drivers of Business Investment. It's a joint work with Sylvia. She's from Business Development Bank of Canada. And we know productivity growth is important. We also know investment and capital intensity is the most important component of labor productivity growth. But after a financial crisis, about 10 years ago, the business investment in Canada has been very low. And so if we, if we look at the contribution of investment for productivity growth after 2010, only half of actually 0.4 percentage points of labor productivity growth is coming from investment. And but before 2010, it's about 1 percentage point of labor productivity growth is coming from the investment. So now the contribution from investment to productivity growth is less than half of what we used to have. And this investment, of course, weak investment is also observed in the United States and other OECD countries. So objective of this paper is we want there are two objectives. So what are the drivers of business investment in Canadian firms? And the second, what are the main factors behind recent weakness of business investment? To my knowledge, actually, this is probably the first paper in Canada that use microdata to look at those two issues. There are many papers from other countries. I guess it's probably lack of good data on investment. So there are many, of course, previous studies, previous discussions about why Canada has weak investment after the financial crisis. And Bill Robinson from CD Howe, he has a paper, it's covered widely in the media, and he listed lots of potential causes of the weak investment in Canada. And there are some usual suspects, tax competitiveness and the barriers to international interprovincial trade, or maybe there's they call it blunted competitive pressure from rising industry concentrations. And he also talk about, also usual suspect, the bottlenecks in getting energy to markets. And they also talk about the rising electricity costs. But I haven't seen any actual studies on this, of course. And Wilkins, and she was deputy governor of Bank of Canada. Of course, they want to know what the investment in Canada, and so they'll discuss lots of she discussed lots of structural factors that may affect the investment. And the first one probably is coming from banking, normally the weak demand arising from trade tensions in the population engines and demographic changes, and she also mentioned the electricity costs and the regulatory burdens and the barrier to international trade. And there are a number of studies and in the US and OECD from OECD, and this is the 2 MBR papers and probably now it's published. And they talk about weakness of business investment in the US probably related to increasing concentrations. And if you look at the US, there's lots of increase in industry concentrations. It's not surprising, big firms is getting bigger and bigger, and you don't have to look further. Amazon is so big, and so it's maybe they speculated that maybe recently weakness investment is related to increased concentrations. And the other one, we talk lots of increase in intangibles, come from this network, increasing knowledge capitals. Maybe actually they found the MBE papers and they found the increase in intangible accounts most of the decline in business investment in fixed capitals. So their hypothesis actually they're finding probably. I'm not sure how they apply to other countries. They're finding the decline in business investment fixed capital is not really a decline. It's more like because of more investing different type of assets. We are not measuring, so it's kind of more or less measurement. So if we include everything, both the intangible, tangibles, we may not see a decline in investment. So business are switching, just shifting towards some other assets we're not measured. Probably Emily will talk about the data. Data is come from our longitudinal database, and we call it NAV, National Accounts Longitudinal Micro Database. It's derived from different admin files, and the T2, T4, PD7. This file also has to be linked, has been linked to different surveys, like survey of business strategy, proprietary use, business strategy innovations, and also linked to export, import, and register, import files. So so we're linking. We have this file. Basically, they track firms over time, track their entry, exit, growth over time, and provide their financial information for all incorporated business operating in Canada. These are standard. There are a lot more, of course. Here, at least for my analysis, of course, we focus on output and inputs. And we also, more importantly, here we use a Schedule 8 because the firm has to report investment in physical assets, Schedule 8. There's another schedule, I forgot the name of the schedule, and the firm of course, have to report investment in R&D to claim the R&D credit. So there's a different schedule from tax returns. So that's it. The file started in 2000. Most recent year is 2019. And so it's kind of up to date. But for this paper, I only use that up to 2017. So this is just look at the trend in investment in constant dollars per unit of labor, basically per hours worked per worker. The blue line is the data Stats Canada published, and it also comes from our multi-factor productivity programs. And the green line, it's a longer trend, and go back. We can plot all the way, go back to 1961, of course, not actually even before 1961. But in here, I just focus on after 1990s. You'll see, there's big before 2006, and before the financial crisis, you see the increasing trend in investment per hours worked. But after around the 2006 or financial, the time of financial crisis, 2010, it's more or less flat and green. And the data coming from our micro data, the data is shows similar trends. It's basically more or less flat. It's not exactly tracking each other, but you can see that's flat. The orange, the orange lines starting from 2005. So it's the investment per hour. It's more or less flat. Those trends track each other. They are not identical, of course. Their coverage is different, but the trend is very similar. So that's kind of important. And of course, Bill Dobson from CDHL, he documented this trend. This is well documented. And this is probably I talk about it because the weakness of the investment and the contribution from capital intensity to productivity growth declined a lot after 2010, about 0.4 percentage points of labor productivity growth is coming from investment after 2010. We used to get like 1 percentage point from investment. So it's slow. Actually, if you look at the US numbers, even lower. So so this decline in investment is not unique to Canada. It's everywhere. Yeah, US probably, if anything, declines a lot bigger. And so that's first look at the trends. Here, I just focus on our micro data. Because the BDC of the Business Development Bank of Canada, they want to know the investment by type of firms and who are investing, who are not investing. So here I just listed by the classified firm by small three size: small firms, medium firms, large firms. The small one is top lines, and the top lines, and the median is orange line, orange, medium, large. So if you look at the trend, it's hard to see, I guess. For the small firms, investment per hour's worth, not really actually increased. Not changed that much. That it's increased. But the decline is more or less concentrated in large, medium-sized firms. So that's one. So a decline is probably a little bit bigger for large firm and medium-sized firms. And here, I also plotted the investment per worker by country of control. And the orange line is for foreign controlled firms. And the two lines more or less track each other, except after 2014 or 2014-15. For foreign controlled firms, investment declined a lot. And I think around that period, also people talking about the foreign controlled firms, maybe they are retreating from Canada. If you look at the newspaper, there are lots of discussions about this, and maybe associated with the commodity, of course, decline commodity price after 2014. So these are the trends. Of course, BDC want to know who are investing, investment by type of firms, and they also want to know, of course, what are the determinants of investment, and they also want to ask the model to predict what will be future trend investment. So that's how they want to know, this kind of regression analysis. So these are quite standard. I include the investment intensity as dependent variables, investment in constant dollars. Independent variables, and I have measured captured the regulatory and business environment. So I calculate concentration. You can calculate enough concentration from our files, and you can, of course, because we track firms over time, so you can calculate entry exit rate. And we also calculate the effective tax rate from the files. We know how much firms are paying tax and tax credit. If you carefully sum up all these different sales and subtract few sales, kind of get effective tax rates. Yeah, but it's average tax rates from the file we always get, not marginal tax rates and people thinking about. You kind of get those effective tax rates. So you can do lots with those files. And the investment opportunities, how do we model? We don't know how to model. I just use output growth of the firms. And, if you see big output growth of the firm, probably also invest more opportunity to invest. And on the investment, type of, because people talk about shift to intangibles. That's what I try to capture. Do they have investment opportunity in knowledge, other intangible capitals? Yeah, other firm specific factor we call debt asset ratios, and lots of variables associated with internal cash flows and the cash flows within earnings. So these are sets of variables I included. Okay, it should be good. So here, when people work, Benoit probably knows, when people work on these files, so first you have to think more carefully what are the sample you're going to use. There's lots of noise in the database, and the first thing, the first thing I have to do is get rid of the firm that has no employment, does not have hire anybody. You're surprised to see lots of firms in the files, incorporated firms, and have no paid employee, so they have just owners. And of course, lots of them have no investment over the entire 13-year period. They did not invest anything, so I exclude those firms. The other one is more tricky. People normally clean the database for outliers. Here we try different procedures. The standard two key procedures, and the other is more like it's kind of arbitrary, ad hoc. I guess I just got rid of 1% of the sample with highest investment per workers, and I can do the 5%. 5%, it turns out we're going to exclude lots of investment. So I think for the analysis, I just exclude top 1%, and I try to do other things. So the other one, they were surprised. The top 1% of these firms then actually account for 25% of investment. So you think about our model, we still don't know what's going on with this 25% of investment. So we talk about the average firms, how they are doing, and they're superstar firms. Investment is, most of the investment come from very few firms. That's a fact we know. So I guess we'll do this kind of analysis. We have to be careful what we are choosing for the samples, how we interpret the results. Depends on the samples. So. Okay, so here, I present a bunch of regression results, and here just first one, I just present 2 columns, but results, if you use other specification, it's very similar. So, dependent variable, the investment per workers. If you look at first, rows, it's concentrations. I construct Herfindahl concentration index from at I think 2-digit levels from the files. Yeah, it turns out it's not related to investment, because the US study, coming from US study, maybe investment is related to concentrations. In Canada, it's not. I interpreted this as, concentration is not a really good measure for competition, in Canada, because, even, if you, industry is dominated by 2 or 3 firms, you can still have lots of competition from other countries, kind of small open economies. So that's normal, I guess, justifications, I think. The second row is, I look at the entry rates. I guess this kind of very significantly related to investment. So high entry rate is associated with more investment. T ratio, yeah, significant at 5. Oh yeah, it's marginally significant, I guess 5%. And so how do we interpret high entry rates? Maybe high entry rate is signals more investment opportunities, so you want to invest. The other high interest entry rate is more, it may signal more. It's the industry is more dynamic, so you tend to invest more. The other one is the exit rate is negative related to investments. Maybe high exit rate is high. So not how to interpret. I still thinking more carefully about this, how we interpret these results. But right now, in my interpretation for the exit rate, high exit rate maybe signal in the industry is declining. So you tend to invest less. And I also put a lot of cash flow variable like short-term liquidity, and the profits, retained earnings. Nothing is significant. Because remember, if you look at the newspaper, there's lots of discussion about the Canadian firms has tons of cash, internal funds, but they are not investing. But my results seem to suggest, investment is not really related to internal funds, internal cash flows of the firms. I think from Bank of Canada talk a lot about lots of the cash flows, and they are not investments. Hey, not probably confirm those suspicions discussions. The other one is significant. I look at the debt asset ratio. Actually, this the firm carry lots of debt. It has tend to invest less. When the firm has lots of debt, maybe they are less willing to invest more. I guess that's my interpretation. That signal financial constraint. I don't know. So I still need to think more careful about to interpret, but it's kind of robust, no matter what I do. The third one, effective tax rates. Tax rates, not really related to investments. So that's probably other people also found this. Or maybe another reason. Of course, I have to be careful about how we interpret this. Effective tax rates we're constructed from the file is a kind of average tax rates. Maybe if we think about the marginal tax rates, maybe it will be effective investment. But that's my justifications. And of course, we also did a bunch of regression by asset types. Probably don't. It's basically give some idea about how they are related to different type of assets, machine equipment. And I think it's very similar to all assets. So maybe we don't have to go through this. And we also did a bunch of regression by country of control. We do one regression for foreign controlled firms, and the other one is domestic controlled firms. And remember, for all firms, concentration is not related to investment, but the concentration appears to be related to investment for foreign controlled firms. Actually, foreign controlled firms tend to invest more in the machine equipment in more concentrated industries. That probably makes sense. The foreign firms, they come to Canada is not either for I guess for their knowledge assets, and sometimes investing in oil, gas, or natural resource sectors. Those industries tend to be very concentrated. So that's why, it has to be very careful how to interpret these numbers. The entry-exit rates are not related to investment foreign control firms, but we know entry-exit rate is very much related to the investment for domestic controlled firms. Maybe incentive for investment for foreign controlled firms in Canada is kind of different from domestic controlled firms. That's my interpretation. And we also did the bunch of firm size. So I'm not sure. Maybe it was saying the entry rate is related to the investment by large firms, and not related to investment for small firms. I have to think more careful about this, how to interpret this. So there are differences between small and large firms. And so we have these kind of results. It's kind of interesting. We conclude the entry-exit rate is related to investment, and debt asset ratio is not or it's negative related to investment. And the other one is people talk about cash flow internal funds. They are not related to investment. So we want to say, have rough calculation how much of the decline investments come from some of the variables in our data. So based on regression results. And here, before I do that, I'll plot some trend in debt asset ratio. We know this variable is very kind of important for investment. So if you look at debt asset ratio coming from our file, actually increased. I better double check. If other people also, I guess other people also found this result. Debt asset ratio increased in Canadian firms. This is one we know that I plotted entry-exit rate only after 2005 because lots of study talk about the long-term decline in the entry rates. So if you look at entry rates in the blue lines, even in our short period, there's still decline from 12% to 8%. Big decline, I guess. 12% entry rates. If you go back, 1980s, you will see longer term decline in entry rates. The exit rate declined up to like 2000. After 2000 is more or less flat. So I see also exit rate, the orange lines. It's more or less flat up to 2012, but after 2012, there's some increase. So that's kind of new. So I checked, I did not see any published study to look at a slight increase in exit rate after 2012. But, these are not surprising, except maybe some new results in after 2012, and some increase in exit rates. So, I use this kind of trend, did some rough calculations, and, so I had 30% of decline, I calculate 30% of the decline in investment after 2005 is coming from these three factors. Declining entry rates, some increase in exit rates, and increase in debt asset ratios. It turns out debt asset ratio accounts most of the decline in investment in per workers. The decline in entry rates accounted for 8% of the decline in investment. Maybe I should mention one interpretation for decline in entry rate in the literature is coming from decline dynamism of the industries, maybe not less dynamic, less competitive, less competitions. So this, maybe this seems to be consistent with other discussion, but they only account for 8%. Some recent increase in exit rate accounted for 7% of decline in investment. That has to do with decline industries, maybe less investment in natural gas sectors. The debt asset ratios, maybe it has to do with financial constraint, or maybe I guess at some point then when firm carry lots of debt, they are less willing to invest. So the conclusion is okay. That's no okay. I should have enough time. So we know that after 2000 financial crisis, investment per household is more or less flat, but if you look at different type of firms, this decline for large medium-sized firms, but small firms not much decline actually. If anything, there's some increase, and the investment per will decline more for foreign controlled firms than for domestic controlled firms. So this is only after 2017. So, in the summer, this in summer, I'll extend this database in our finding to 2019. So see what happened to last 2 years. So these are a bunch of regression results. It's kind of robust, no matter what I do, it's robust. Entry rate is positive related to investment. Exit rate is negative related. Debt asset ratio, I already say that, cash flows and maybe not related, and maybe has to consider with some discussion why firm has tons of cash, no investment. That's kind of, and the other one, there's no evidence in Canada, so wiki investment in intangible represents a shift towards intangible assets, because MBL study in the MBL paper, where there's a US, the tons of much of the kind of investment, fixed capital is coming from actually firms are not investing. Now there are firms switch their strategy, investing in intangibles. So it's in Canada where I don't see that. And the concentration index not related to investment in Canada, they are related to investment in the US. So my justification is, concentration is not a really good measure. If you focus on domestic sales, not a really good measure of the competition competitiveness. So here's some kind of rough estimates, and say some of the kinds in investment is coming from decline entry rate, maybe has to do with decline dynamics or dynamism of the industries, and some of the decline has to do with, and it's coming from increasing debt asset ratios, and that financial constraint part. Maybe it's just signal, when firm has lots of debt, they are less willing to invest more. Actually, also speculate, this has to be careful, speculate that this finding maybe has implications for economic recovery from the COVID. During the COVID, I'm pretty sure, I have to double check, the firm has been accumulating lots of debt to cover their loss. So you'll see lots of increase in the debt asset ratio in firms. So according to our preliminary work, this cannot be good for investment, because we know that the firm has lots of debt, are less willing to invest. So this is likely to reduce future investment and productivity growth. Thank you so much. It's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wulong, for a very interesting presentation. Very nice slides and lots of nice results. But also, I think your presentation raises a lot of questions that people will be able to tackle using the data if they want to. You should check the chat if you didn't, because there are a lot of questions, and Amélie and Beryl were busy answering questions about the data while you were presenting. So you should thank them. One question that I think was not answered, somebody was wondering about whether the data had information on the type of investment, for example, greenfield versus acquisitions or etc. Or is it just an amount invested, or do you know what the money was invested in?
Okay. Yes, the investment is coming from CCA, you know, the capital consumption allowance schedules. So they have type of investments. So, you know, even in my study, you can roughly, you know, disaggregate total investment into 3 types: the ICT, non-ICT, and the buildings. And in terms of investment in clean tech, yeah, I think that's the question. Actually, there's an ongoing project between us and I think NRCan. You know, there's different schedules. You know, I think about more or less about 10 years ago. You know, if firms are investing in a certain type of clean technology, so you can claim credit. I forgot which schedule. There's one schedule actually where you need a schedule to identify those firms who invest in clean tech. You know, you can, you know, go to Revenue Canada, claim certain credit. So that's from a different, actually, if you search in Google, you will know that schedule. You know, they have kind of, you know, clean tech. Actually, this are because, yeah, you know, so even investment data, all these clean tech, CCA, very few people are using this, and so, you know, more people use, more will understand, you know, the type data we have in the system, or are they noisy, or they're good, or so, you know, we welcome, of course, certainly people using the files. And R&D, we talk about research development expenditure, and this is coming from different schedules. You know, for those firms who are doing research and development, of course, they can claim sign, you know, on the credit. So that's a different schedule. That's how we got these different type of information. Yes.
Thank you. And maybe one last question before we move on to the next presentation. I think Amélie mentioned that the micro business data had information on industry at the 2 next digit level. But you said you were using 4 digits, is that right? So you're not using the microdata exactly, but you're using a different version of the data, or?
No, I'm sorry, yeah. So of course, you know, I'm so sorry. To clarify, you know, I'm using this microdata, but the microdata for every firm are classified according to 4-digit next. So you can kind of know what kind of industry they are working with. That means when I say control for next 4-digit industry, that means, you know, every firm is assigned to 1-digit code. Yeah, that's maybe that's what you're talking about. Yeah, actually, next 4 digits. I think probably the way also next 5, 6 digits, but you know how good they are. You know, yeah, but yeah, we can normally next 4 digits we already have, like, I don't know, probably 200 industry already there. Lots of details. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe check the chat. There are some questions I guess you can tackle if you want. And let's, since time, thank you again for presenting, and let's move on to the next presentation by Danny Leung from Statistique Canada, who will tell us about patenting and high growth firms. Danny?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, Benoit?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me just share my screen. Is it working? You see my slides?
Yeah, it's
your
there.
slide.
Perfect.
We don't see you, so.
Okay, great. So, bonjour à tous et merci de me voir invité aujourd'hui à partager certaines de mes recherches avec vous. Ce projet est spécial pour moi parce que la dernière fois que je l'ai touché, avant la semaine passée, c'était 2 jours avant le début de la pandémie en mars 2020. Après ça, j'ai dû travailler sur d'autres priorités. Donc, pour moi, c'est une bonne signe que je peux retourner à ce projet. Le reste de cette présentation sera en anglais, mais les diapos sont disponibles en français. Advance, please. So, as I was saying, this project actually started before the pandemic and had widespread support through the government of Canada to build the database. The idea here was to link the PATStat database, which I'll describe a bit later, to other firm level data at StatsCan. And those other firm level data are basically the business research microdata, except for one exception I found, one variable that actually is not there, right? But the idea, if everything had gone to plan, the idea was that these patent data was going to be part of the first wave of the BRM. But it's just the fact that I didn't have time to work on it and the documentation as well, that it didn't make the first cut, right? But the idea here is that once I'm finished the documentation and this initial study, that the variables that appear in the study will also be available on the BRM as well. So probably the second wave, right? And so, as I mentioned in the title, right, this presentation is going to be on the impact of patenting on firm performance, specifically on whether a firm that patents in a previous period, what's the probability that they experience a period of higher growth later on. There is not much evidence at the firm level that looks at the importance of patenting on firm growth. Maybe this is due partly to the lack of firm level data. While the patent data are accessible in this format and in others, having that linkage to firm level data is rare. Some industry level studies have been done, but there's not a lot on firms. This one project that I cite here, Eckert, Langinger, and Zhao, was actually using an older version of this database that looks at whether firms that patent, whether they choose to patent either in kind of the Canada or the US. And then there's a study by Peter Hannell that looks at the characteristic firms that patent and the propensity to innovate if they patent. And I think this is based on old survey data. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be able to work on this project and also to, after it's done, as I said, make available all the data in the BRM. So let me say a few words about the PATStat database, given Amélie also already mentioned the BRM. The PATStat database basically is a worldwide patent database. Patent offices around the world send patent applications information to the European Patent Office, and the European Patent Office compiles all this information into a database, right? This is actually a lot of work because a lot of the times when you go to the patent offices to ask for the patent data, it comes in a very format that is very difficult to work with, like XML, right? And you have to do a lot of processing to grab the information in the fields that you want. And so one of the biggest benefits of just going and buying PATStat was that they created the database, right? And so it has a lot of information on it, on applications, on grants, on whether the patent is the first in its family or the follower, information on patent citations, the type of patents in terms of the technology class, information on the applicants and the inventors, and also some information on the legal status. Basically, we know who's assigned the patent at the at the application when it's granted, but it's not mandatory to report changes in legal status. And so there's some information, but it's not complete. Right? And so what we do with this information is we link part of it to Canadian residence firms. And so the part are the applications to CIPO and other patent offices around the world. There's around 400 applications between 1875 and 2018, where the applicant or the inventor, has a Canadian address, so Canadian resident, right? And in the current period, 2001 to 2016, the period covered by the BRM, there's approximately 265 applications, 65,000 applications, and a large amount of them are associated with companies. And so, our current linkage covers a large fraction of the applications made in Canada. Not in Canada, by Canadian resident firms, right? And so, this slide gives a little summary of what we're actually doing and the part of the data that we're using. And so as I mentioned, the idea of this paper is to look at whether filing a patent application actually has implications for future growth, right? And so controlling for other characteristics. And so the way we set up the data is that we look at 3 cohorts, right? A cohort goes from basically looking at high growth, whether high growth or not in 2013 to 16, 2010 to 13, and 2007 to 2010, where high growth is defined as the OECD definition, having at least 20% compound annual growth rate in revenue over the last 3 years, right? And the explanatory variables of whether they're high growth or not come from before that period. Most of the variables I'll describe later come from the BRM, but an important one comes from past that, whether you filed an application or not, right? There are some sample restrictions. We look at firms that only had 10 employees in the last year, that had positive revenue in both the first and last year, and we exclude certain names, the healthcare, education, and public administration. The idea of having those kind of exclusions was just to remove some kind of very small firms that are high, potentially high growth, but it's not the high growth that we were thinking of, right? The ones that would really, I would say, kind of contribute to the growth of the economy. Rather, there could be just like, variation in the data. So in some sense, it's just kind of cleaning the noise in the data, right? So in the end, what is the incidence of high growth in this database, and what is the impact on patenting? Overall, when we look at those 3 cohorts, we see that there's 11% of the firms are high growth, right? And that patenting has potentially a big impact, right? On the first table or graph, right, you see that the percentage of high growth firms among firms that applied for a patent in the past, right, is around 21, 22%, compared to the 11%, let's say, for firms that did not apply for a patent, right? And so, potentially there is quite a large impact there. Of course, there's many other characteristics that are related to whether a firm is high growth or not. Some of those other variables are displayed here as well on this slide. Employment size of firm, of course, is very important. Small firms are more likely to be high growth than larger firms in employment size. The age matters as well. Younger firms are more likely to become high growth than older firms. And as Wulong pointed out, I think that's debt to asset. Yeah, debt to asset, that matters as well. And here you see a kind of a non-linear relationship, right? Yes, access to financing matters. The higher debt you have, the more likely you are to be high growth. But then that first quintile also is has a high propensity to become high growth. And here you could think that these are the ones that maybe have low debt but have a lot of equity financing, right? And so that's the other kind of means for growth, and maybe even a more important ones for certain types of firms, right? So we control for other firm characteristics as well, because we know that there are certain activities that the firm undertakes that is related to patenting, but also related to high growth, right? For example, whether they conducted R&D or not. R&D in many studies have been shown to increase firm performance. And here, whether you conducted R&D or not is also, highly correlated with whether you file a patent or not. We also control for whether the firm filed a had a previous patent application, and whether they received what I call an infusion of equity. And here is where there is one variable that is not in the BRM, I think, and that's this infusion of equity variable that I've created. And here, the idea here is not just to look at retained earnings or shareholder equity, but to take the difference, right? So look at the change in equity that can't be explained by the change in retained earnings. And so the idea here is that, the firm had some type of outside equity investment in that previous period. So it could be that the owner themselves put in additional equity, or that they had some kind of angel investor, venture capitalist putting in additional equity. And so that's the idea, right? And so as you can see a very, you see what you expect. Basically, if you did receive a sizable infusion of equity, you have a much more higher propensity to be filing a patent application as well. Okay. And so, as I kind of showed in the first, the idea here is the estimation of Probit model. The first bar shows what happens when there is no controls. And so the marginal impact of filing a patent increases the probability of being a high growth firm by over 8%. Once you control for age, size, debt, past growth, industry, exporter status, whether you're foreign controlled or not, and cohort dummies, that declines to about 5, just under 6. And once you put in those other kind of, let's say, firm activities like conducting R&D, having a previous application of a patent, or having an equity infusion, it drops to about 2.5%, right? And so still significant, but what does that mean, right? Is that like, how does that compare to other things? And so that's what I do on the right-hand side here, right? I contrast the marginal impact of finding a patent to some of the impacts from other variables. That 2.5% is comparable to the impact of previous patent applications, slightly lower than whether the firm conducted R&D or not, about the same as having an infusion of equity, and more than being an exporter or being foreign controlled, right? So overall, in considering the other variables, right, it's sizable, right? The impact of filing the patent. Just to show some other results here, I had the relationship between the impact of filing a patent by firm size as well. And as you can see, having larger firms, just like the summary statistics suggested, being larger in terms of employment size decreases the probability of high growth. Being older decreases the probability of high growth. Having your previous revenue growth also has an impact on whether you're high growth or not. You see both some kind of persistence in being high growth. And so, for example, if you were in the 5th quintile previously of revenue growth, you're more likely to be high growth. But also you see some mean reversion. Like you see if you're in the bottom quintile in the previous period, you're also more likely to be high growth. And for the debt asset ratio, what you see in the summary statistics also bears out when you control for other factors. Having debt matters, but if you look at the first quintile, having a lot of equity matters as well. Right? So I think for me, this is kind of the most interesting slide. and and that's kind of like having a kind of stepping back and thinking about, what these results mean, right? And so far, like we really only focused on a little bit of the variation in data, whether you're high growth or not, right? But there's a lot of variation within that, and that kernel density on the left-hand side kind of gives you an idea of what I mean. And so basically that plots, instead of just the probability of high growth or not by firms that apply and don't apply, it looks at the distribution of the compound annual growth rates, right? And what you notice is that firms that apply for a patent do have a higher mean, right? But there's a higher dispersion as well, right? And if you kind of focus on the right-hand side, this is kind of the experiment we were just looking at. Firms that file for a patent are more likely to be high growth, right? Because we're talking about high growth, that is at the 20% compound annual growth line, right? And you can see where the result is coming from. But if you look at the left-hand side, interestingly, you can see that firms that apply for a patent are more likely also to be a low growth firm, right? And so, it's interesting. I did the experiment. Well, what happens when I kind of put all these kind of explanatory variables in, and that's what you see on the chart below, or so in the bar graph on the other side, right? And again, once you control for other factors, the marginal impact declines. And in this case, it actually declines to 0, not significantly different from 0. But that's if I kind of kept the threshold at like minus 20% as a definition for low growth, right? You can kind of tell from the chart, right? The kernel distribution, if you kind of move that around, you may get a bit of a different outcome. And indeed, if you kind of like change that 20%, there are ones where you can find that this marginal effect is still positive, right? So what's going on here, right? Like on one hand, you can think that maybe just patenting activity and conducting R&D is just like entrepreneurial activity that's really uncertain, right? That it's like a gamble, right? And you have both positive and negative outcomes, right? So that's one possible interpretation. Another is that maybe some things on the left-hand side are picking up other firm behavior, right? That a lot of these small firms are not necessarily aiming to be high growth. Maybe they have a different exit strategy, and that their idea here is not to commercialize, but to get it up to a point and then to sell their firm, right? And so it'd be very interesting, of course, as a follow-up, then to kind of see if what happens to those firms, right? That once they change ownership, then subsequently do they grow, right? And so lots of possible next steps. I mentioned just one just right now, but of course there's a lot of other things to do in terms of thinking about whether patenting in, for example, Canada, US, or Europe, or Japan matters, right? There's that dimension to look at. There's also the dimension, the extensive versus the intensive margin. I just looked at if you patent or not. I didn't look at how many, and maybe in the type of patent, the technology class, and also whether the patent was the first in its family. So really if it's an invention rather than just like an add-on incremental innovation. And so, then there's a question of spillovers, right? That whether patenting in one firm actually has an influence on the activities and the performance of others in its area or in its industry, right? And so a lot of work to do, right? But as I say here, what I'm committed myself to do is to complete this first study and some documentation on the variables and have it included in the second wave of the BRM. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Danny. So if you have time, you can monitor the chat. It's still being very active. I did see one question about types of patents. Do you have information on that? And do you know if there is a different impact on growth depending on the type? I don't know, not an expert on patenting, but you would think that if you patent a product or a process, it would have a different impact on growth than
yeah. So right now, I haven't looked into much of the heterogeneity of the possible impact. There is information on the type along a number of dimensions, right? There is, for example, the patent classification, it's the IPC, International Patent Classification Code, right? Which gives the field of patenting. There's also the fact that whether you're just patenting in Canada or where you patented in other offices at the same time, that will have an impact. And as I say, also whether it was the first in its family, right? Whether it was, I would call it truly an invention or an incremental patent that kind of builds on another patent, right? But no, that's highly related to another patent. And so there's a lot of heterogeneity to explore, and that's in the database. But as I say, this is a kind of a first pass. Right?
It's nice to hear that there is more work to do. So it's always nice to hear. So thank you very much, Danny. We'll open the floor for questions. Well, I don't know if people still have questions after everything that went on in the chat room. But if you have a question that you want to ask directly, you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature of Zoom, and I'll ask for your mic to be open so you can ask your question, and you just say to who you want to address your question. I see in the chat, so if researchers want to use the patent data, is it possible, or they have to create their own patent data and ask it to be merged with the, so how does it work?
Yeah, so the idea here is that once I'm done the documentation, it will be added to the BRM so that the researchers won't have to add it themselves. But the caveat here is that because the PatStat is a licensed product, right? I can't just put the whole thing there, right? I really need to incorporate it into a product so that, yeah, to kind of abide by the license agreement.
So you realize now that because you said this, if there is no patent data in the CRDCN in the next year, I will come back to you and ask, where is the data?
Yes, you should, right? So
perfect. Thank you very much. Any more questions? I see people are shy. I'll give it one more minute. So you see that Beryl, Amélie have done a really good job of answering all the questions in the chat. All right, so I say we go to lunch then. Is it possible to eat outside in Ottawa, or you're stuck inside at your home? Well, you should have come to Montreal, then you would. I see one question in the chat, sorry. Patent data, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so for the patent data themselves, there's not an industry code. We only get the industry code when we link it to the firm level data. And so the industry code would follow the industry of the firm applying for the patent. And is there any better indicators of innovation than patents and R&D intensity? You remember that these data so far are from administrative data sources. So of course there's other, and patenting and R&D intensity is only one measure of innovation. There's many others. Well, I guess this is why you kind of mentioned this. But from the administrative data sources, it's there's still some possibilities, I think. Wulong mentioned some, right? Because in the investment data, in the administrative data, there are kind of investment types. And he did allude to the fact that there is possibly some clean tech investment that we could kind of pull out from the investment data. But aside from that, yeah, nothing really comes to mind that can be easily added. Right?
I guess
the
one
survey sources, of course, right? But then, of course, it'd be not necessarily the whole universe of firms, right?
So I guess one indicator of innovation is the survey, like the survey of an innovation and business strategy, where they ask the firm, did you innovate or not? I guess you could match your patent data to SIBS and see how strongly this survey answers correlates with the patent information.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, I would like to thank you all again for coming. Hopefully we talk about seed next year at the same time. And we'll do it here, and then I can invite you all for lunch to thank you for your presentations. For follow-up, you can contact me or Carole Vincent. Thank you for coming. I put the link on the CIQSS summer school and CIQSS in general in the chat. You're invited to check those links, and thank you very much again to everyone.
Thanks, Benoit.
Bye.
Merci.
Thank you.
Bye.